Hello, everyone. Eric Rainey here, and welcome to the 82nd episode of the Writ Podcast. This week, I'm joined by former party pollsters Dan Arnold and Andrew Enns to discuss the latest in politics. And also joining the pollster panel this week is James Valcke. James is Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints Research, which has polled for the NDP in elections across the country. He's worked on various central campaigns, including the NDP's breakthrough 2011 election. Dan, of course, is Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara. He's worked as Director of Research and Advertising in the Prime Minister's office, and he polled for the Trudeau Liberals in each of the past three elections. And Andrew is Executive Vice President at Leger. He has polled for the Federal Conservatives during the Harper years and has polled for provincial Conservative parties across Canada. Dan, Andrew, welcome back. And James, good of you to join us.
Glad to be here.
All right, so I wanted to start with just a general thing because we've been looking at a lot of the polls that have been coming out over the last few weeks. Just on Thursday, there was a Leger poll showing about a 3-point lead for the Conservatives. There was an Abacus poll on Wednesday with an 8-point lead. Nanos the week before had a tie. Pollara, when they came out a little while ago, also had a tie. So Dan and Andrew, I'll just start with you, and Dan, maybe you can pick it up. Just curious to know if you see anything that has changed since we last chatted just before the holidays.
I don't think a lot's happening. And you probably want more than a 5-second answer, so I guess I'll have to add a little bit to that. I mean, we toss vote numbers on our polls pretty regularly, and really haven't seen much in terms of a significant shift since November. There's obviously going to be noise and little ebbs and flows. I think we see that in the media polls, as you should, just by the whole theory of polling, right? There should be numbers that go up and down, but I get the sense that there's not a lot of really consequential issues, events that are occurring right now. On Parliament Hill. If I was, if I was on a betting market trying to kind of put money on the outcome of the next election campaign, I think I'd actually pay more attention to the monthly inflation numbers right now than I would to the latest polling horse race numbers that come out, because I think that's probably more consequential in terms of what happens in a year or 2 years or whenever we have the next election campaign, as opposed to just whatever kind of ebbs and flows are going on right now. Because I can't imagine Canadians are riveted to their daily political dose of news these days, given just there's not a lot of really big things happening, from my opinion.
Yeah, Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, as you mentioned, our recent polls had a 3-point lead for the Conservatives. The poll before that, we had it neck and neck. I think there's a little bit of movement within the margins. I think if anything, to add to Dan's comment, and I agree totally on the economic situation, some of the indicators in terms of inflation, interest rates. I think as well as you start to see some turbulence that occasionally bubbles up and impacts federal numbers out of provinces, out of some of the regions. I think for example, in Atlantic Canada, you've got a situation now. It's largely the blue team in provincial power there, apart from Newfoundland and Labrador. And when they've had a rough go on the healthcare side. Higgs and Houston and Nova Scotia have had a pretty tough couple months, and I think that actually sort of it sort of creates some turbulence even at the federal level. So and Ontario is another area where you start to see that sort of bubble up, and I know we'll talk about healthcare in a bit, but at that federal, I agree totally with Dan. I mean, I think Canadians are really fixated on a lot of some of the issues, primarily sort of the household budgets, and they'll get to the federal politics and the party leaders when the time comes, and they're probably not hoping it comes really soon.
Yeah, I don't think so. James, I'd hear you also on that, but also I had a question from a reader, and he was more or less wondering how the NDP is going to really take on Poilievre in terms of him targeting some of their ridings, some of these blue-collar ridings that we saw Doug Ford able to take. That does seem to be a specific challenge that the NDP has to face, but I'm curious also just to hear your broader thoughts as well on where things stand.
Yeah, I would agree with Dan and Andrew. On the surface, the numbers coming back are pretty steady, but as they both alluded to, under the surface of the horse race, there is a boiling concern about issues that are affecting people's lives. It's inflation, it is the economy, it is the cost of living, it is healthcare. Those things are a big concern, and I think that there's things to watch. We're seeing a bit of shifts in certain regions. I know Some regional polls out of Quebec that have sample sizes large enough to make an assessment are showing some flux. That'll be something to watch. But there is that sentiment under the surface that is not quite yet come out, but I'm not sure where it's going to go. Things are pretty steady as it goes. With regards to, I think the question was some of the blue collar workers, the blue-orange fights. This is one of those things, and I kind of, this connects back to what I mentioned about the polls. There's issues of cost of living, issues of inflation, grocery bills going up. People are feeling that all over the place. No place more than some of those blue collar regions. In you're looking at Ontario, it's Southwest Ontario, the Windsor, the Niagara, that corridor down there, and Northern Ontario, and they're feeling it all over the country as well too, in the prairies. And I guess, I think one of the things you can look at that's happened is New Democrats have definitely, at least federally from Jagmeet's side, have made a bit of a pivot to talk more about those bread box or, bread and butter issues. And I think that they're feeling that. I think everyone's feeling that. I mean, the Prime Minister did an announcement at a grocery store a month or so ago. Folks know people are upset out there. They're happening. And I think right now the parties are trying to position themselves as the solution that can make your life more affordable, and I think that fight's going to go on for quite some time.
So let's move on to healthcare. I wanted to talk about it as an election issue because obviously it's a top issue for Canadians. We see that in poll after poll that it's one of those top issues, but it is a complicated political issue because obviously there's jurisdictional issues between the federal and the provincial governments. Dan, I'll start with you. With the recent moves that the Liberals have made, they're signing some individual agreements. Word today on Thursday that they got one with the Ontario government. What would be the Liberal thinking behind making this deal and making it as big as they did?
So I think it's pretty clear that healthcare is a big issue, and it's probably grown as an issue. We did some long-term analysis, put out some press release data before Christmas on just kind of how Canada has changed in terms of priorities over the last 30 years at Pollara. And back in 1992, healthcare was a kind of mid to upper tier issue, but not definitely behind jobs and on par with things like post-secondary education, environmental protection. Whereas today, on any poll, it's number one or two, right up there with cost of living, depending how you ask the question. So I think it's pretty clear that it's a big issue today. And I think we've also seen over time that Canadians have grown more pessimistic, more negative towards the quality of healthcare. I've seen some polling as well that would ask Canadians that age-old question of, are we doing better or worse than the US? And we always like to compare ourselves to the Americans. And there's always that kind of smug superiority when it comes to, I think, hockey, beer, and healthcare are probably the three things Canadians always like to feel like we're doing better than the US on. And 20 years ago, majority of Canadians said our healthcare system hands down better than the US. Today, it's 36% say it's better, 26% say it's worse. So, it's still a little bit better, but really you see that erosion over time. And I think when you get an issue like this where it's growing in importance and people are feeling more negative towards the quality of care out there, it creates a lot of opportunities for all the parties, really, because when you're in opposition, you can criticize the government for it, but also it's traditionally an issue that the Liberals are seen to be more credible, at least than the Conservatives on. So I think, for them, it's an opportunity to contrast with the Conservatives and, move away from cost of living, which is maybe an issue where people traditionally trust Conservative parties a bit more, and talk about something where there's a bit more trust towards the Liberals. I think the challenge for them is how do you make it relevant to people, right? Like 46 billion or 20 billion or 10 billion. It sounds great, but like, what does that mean to me at the end of the day? I've done polling where you kind of ask the same question. You say, we're spending 5 billion on this, we're spending 50 million on this, we're spending 50 billion on this. And the results come back exactly the same because nobody knows what $50 billion is. So I think for the Liberals, really, it comes down to how do you tell a bit of a story about what they're doing on healthcare and how's that going to impact people's lives? What's it actually going to mean in terms of outcomes at the end of the day? And if you want to get credit, I think it can't just be we're shoveling more money at this. We have to actually, they have to tell a bit of a story about how it's actually going to change Canadians' lives. And I think that's what they are going to hopefully try to do over the next little while.
James, I wanted to hear you on the NDP's position on this because obviously they're backing up the government. They want to defend publicly funded healthcare. But people are in need, and this is something. And how do they make this an issue without going maybe too far on making it an issue?
Yeah, it's an interesting one right now. I would agree with Dan. A lot of our numbers are showing us too. This is a predominant issue when issues of concern. biggest issue that needs fixing. And the interesting thing about healthcare is it's a bit of a slow burn, right? Like, it doesn't just pop up and go down. It is like trying to turn around a cargo ship. Like, it is hard for governments to make that change, and it takes a while. With regards to the NDP and the party's positionings, you know, I'll take it as somewhat interesting that the premiers met with the prime minister, and there was not this face-à-face. There was not this fight. There was a bit of standoffishness, a bit of posturing, but in the end, they knew that they had to go there to collaborate, to get a deal, because what we're seeing in polls is that people want something to be fixed, right? Like, it is at a state where, you know, sorry, I'll pivot real quick. We do a lot of focus groups, and you can dig into some of those things. And in every single focus group, when we talk about healthcare, any part of this country, every province, every single person has a first-hand or second-hand story about an 8-hour wait, a 15-hour wait, a cousin who didn't get the service they need for months. Like, it is palpable. People can still taste what's going on, and they're not happy. And I guess right now they're looking for someone who can solve it, but it's unclear to them who has the answer, who has the solution. And I think that there might be a point in this issue where associating yourself with it can have a negative impact. It's like, oh, so you're the problem. You're the one in charge. You're the one that's not able to fix it. And I don't know which direction it's going to go, but there is a palpable feeling that it needs to be fixed. And I think that the premiers and the prime minister are reading the tea leaves, and that's why the negotiations in Ottawa went quite smoothly, actually, from my thoughts.
Andrew, does that then explain in a way Poilievre's position, that he trying to pivot away from it as quickly as possible? It's not a really great issue for Conservatives. They'd rather talk about economic issues.
You know, for sure, as Dan said, I mean, it's not an issue that Conservatives tend to think that they're going to drive a lot of vote their way on. Although the last, and certainly, I mean, I always look at healthcare really when it's electoral, it really burns hard at the provincial level. It's actually uncommon when the flames get so high that it starts to singe the guys in Ottawa, but it has. Like, it clearly has. Pandemic driven, the coast to coast, breakdowns, the systemic breakdowns, right? I mean, Nova Scotia is shutting down ERs. Like, we can't take anymore. It's unheard of. And so the flames got high enough. I think the funding side, I mean, look, the challenge for the federal Liberals will be they can finance this stuff, but for it to actually get fixed, you got to rely on the provinces to actually make the changes and fix it. And that's going to be problematic. You know, you hope it's going to get fixed. I think the other kind of devil in the detail, and I think this is interesting, and I'd be curious to James to get your take on this too, is I think you're also seeing the public is more open to like change, innovation, public-private partnerships. You're seeing it in Ontario, you're seeing it in Manitoba, you're seeing it in provinces that maybe were a little less aggressive in that area. Certainly Alberta, you know, you'll continue to see it. You're seeing it in some of the Atlantic provinces, but I do think that starts to put a little pressure on in the federal realm, because I suspect, and I think, you know, Mr. Singh has made comments to the fact that that's not part of the plan. Like, the federal government should be more aggressive about pushing back on sort of the private entrepreneurship in healthcare, even though it's still publicly funded. But I think that's challenging, and I think that's where there's the potential for some friction points, that where healthcare, money-wise, you're right, Eric. I mean, Poilievre will double down on, no, we'll commit to whatever the money is, and in fact we may one up it even. But I think you may see opportunities for the Conservatives to maybe say, hey, let the provinces innovate, you know, let the provinces push into new areas, and see if that starts a little bit of a war between the NDP and the Liberals, to see if that can create some electoral disruption there that might actually benefit the Conservatives to some degree.
Yeah, James, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. It's, like I said, I at this stage right now, I feel like it's quite unpredictable. When we're talking to people in groups and we dive into this, we discover that they just want it fixed, right? They're ordinary people. They don't have the solutions. They're not experts. But the interesting thing that we're seeing in some of the polling is that, and I mean, I think Andrew and Dan will probably agree, is that the perception that politicians are their reputation took a beating over the last 3 years, right? The perception that one politician can do it better than another politician is hard for a lot of the public to take at face value. But an almost inverse reaction is that there's a trust in the frontline workers. There's more trust in frontline workers. As that went down, they went up. And I think there's a big space for a lot of the public service and the healthcare unions to jump in there and say, you know, you can bring in all these things you want, but if you have an MRI, 5 more MRIs don't have staff at them, and you're going to be pulling staff. And I think that where some of the fighting might come in. And then, you know, Andrew, the other thing that I'm always cognizant of is that finger pointing, right? It's like the situation is bad. Who's to blame? You're in charge. You're offering solutions that, like, you know, there's a palpable displeasure with what's going on, and offering solutions may not provide the salve that these people are looking for, right? They may be looking to take a pound of flesh out from someone. So it's really difficult to see how this is going to play out, but that conversation, I think, is happening.
Dan, then if we take it from the provincial perspective, so you're a premier, is there any electoral advantage to blame the feds for problems with the healthcare system? Is that going to pass among voters?
It's hard to say. I mean, again, I think all issues, voters get a lot of confusion between federal and provincial responsibilities. And I think healthcare is probably, just because of it is partly shared, is just as murky on that front. I think it's hard to completely pass the buck off to the federal government. We've definitely seen this be, as mentioned, a big issue in a lot of provincial elections in recent years. I think Nova Scotia is the most obvious example of this, where you actually had a Conservative Party that won an election based on healthcare, which is kind of, again, counter to brand, but speaks to the opportunity there. When people are just pissed at the incumbents for not doing the job, they will look for other solutions, other alternatives. And I think what the lesson from Tim Houston there, I think, was not so much that he even came out and said, we're going to spend a ton of money on healthcare. He actually offered solutions that were very tangible. It's like, we're going to run the testing clinics after hours. We're going to do things with pensions and loans to keep doctors here. And it's kind of common sense stuff. It wasn't just we're going to spend more money at the problem. It's stuff that intuitively made sense to voters. And I think if you can show voters that you've got a plan that actually will lead to better outcomes, I think they're willing to look at any option, really, to see who's going to offer that, whether it's the Liberals or NDP or Conservatives. And as James said, they're looking for someone to fix it, right? So if you come with a plan that sounds credible to fix the problem, I think that creates a lot of opportunities at the provincial level for all parties.
Well, and the Andrew, go ahead. Right? Like, the money's there. So the provinces are really, I think in this sense, I mean, there isn't a premier in the country that's going, okay, you're right, James, they went to Ottawa, they were in agreeable mood, they've got some money, it's going to flow quickly, but that raises the expectations if you're a government, that you've got to start to do something. And, like, you talked about the staffing, the HR situation. I mean, these aren't easy problems to sort of solve. I mean, you're talking 3 to 4 years education, massive recruiting drives in an era in North America where I'm not sure there's a jurisdiction in North America that's not trying to recruit health professionals right now. So this is going to be a problem for provincial governments, because the public's going to see money flowing, but the impact, the benefit, the improvement is still going to take some time, and that's going to create frustration. And
the lag time is...
Yeah. And for some governments, it's going to be probably the death knell, right? Like, they won't recover from that.
Well, Andrew, let's get specific here. Heather Stephenson, Danielle Smith facing re-election this year. Healthcare, is it just a thing that they need to avoid talking about, or do they need to get into it?
Well, certainly, and I think, it's interesting, and I'd be curious from, Dan and James, but the healthcare acuteness is felt across the country, but the kind of the voter internalization of it, I do find, is a little different. In Manitoba, it's really acute. There's no way Premier Stephenson can get away with not addressing healthcare in the next in the pre-writ and writ period. It's going to be as it was. It was a fairly big issue in 2019, and they managed to sort of sidestep at that point in time. But I think it's going to be a very big issue and a very challenging one for them. I think in Alberta, like I find, and I'd be curious in terms of the feedback from James and Dan, but I find it's a slightly different electorate there, and I think healthcare is an issue. There's problems in it, but I also think voters are a bit more balanced as well with respect to other things that may balance this for Danielle Smith in terms of the economy and cost of living. So, um, I think you're going to see Danielle Smith doing things on healthcare, but I think really the battle in that election is going to be who can win the message, like who can make the message on. And I don't think it's guaranteed it's going to be healthcare. Whereas I feel in Manitoba, their healthcare is going to be a very dominant theme in that election. I'm just not convinced that's the case in Alberta, but be curious from James or Dan.
Yeah, well, James, for Wab Kinew and Rachel Notley, healthcare is that the issue for them?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think Rachel announced healthcare teams a while ago, and Danielle Smith, Minister of Health, has said you can expect some stuff in the upcoming budget on primary care. Like there is as Andrew said, there is a pressure on incumbent governments to act, and an expectation. I don't know if that's the discussion they want to have or the argument they want to be, running campaigns on. But I think it's interesting that, it is at the surface of people's minds. It's unavoidable. So there's always that. And I mean, when you look at some of the polls and we found it in our numbers, and other people have found it. It's out there available. Who you trust to manage healthcare? New Democrats do quite well, provincially and federally across the country, regardless of if they're in power, incumbent, opposition, or third or fourth party. Some cases, they often do well, and if that is a top of mind issue, if there's a sense that the incumbent UCP or progressive conservative government isn't acting, there might be an opportunity there. Like when we're breaking down Alberta a little bit. The numbers are pretty split, and the question is who's that mushy middle? Who are those switchers? Who are those people that wake up progressive conservative every day and are inclined to vote UCP, but the New Democrats are trying to convince to come to them, right? Are they in Calgary? Are they women? Is this an issue for them? I think it's going to matter on those little granular details as we go through. So it's difficult to say, but I think as long as this issue is top of mind, I think New Democrats are well positioned to be the solution to it, especially if they're not the incumbent.
Well, let's talk a bit about Alberta more specifically. It is the election on the calendar next. PI might go a bit earlier. We'll see. I don't know if any of you have some in-depth analysis on Prince Edward Island to share. But Dan, how about start with you on Alberta? I'm not going to ask you how the Alberta Liberals are going to do, but what do you think? Where do you think things stand right now in Alberta, just about 3 months out?
I think it's going to be a really fascinating election. I'm kind of jealous because I lived in Alberta for many years, and it was always like, okay, this will be the 12th straight PC government, and this will be the 13th straight PC government, and there weren't a lot of interesting elections. And now that I leave, like every election is like crazy. And I think this one is really interesting too because it's almost presidential in nature, right? You have a clear-cut two-party race. You have two leaders who are both very well known, and a polarized division between them on a lot of issues. And I think, much like presidential races, the popular vote probably isn't going to matter too much, right? Where every poll that comes out for Alberta, every area zooms in on the Calgary numbers, and we've seen polls in the past month that have the UCP leading but losing in Calgary, but other polls that have the NDP leading but losing in Calgary. So, I think there's obviously a few other scattered ridings around the outskirts of Edmonton and Banff, and a couple others, Lethbridge, that are going to be in play too. But I think ultimately, it's going to come down to Calgary. And I think the polling would generally show that it's competitive in Calgary at the very least. And I think that means the election will be competitive. I think both parties have a pretty clear path to victory. And on the NDP side, what they've got going for them would be, I think, most polling would show a clear leadership advantage of Notley over Smith, even if you're voting UCP. Smith's personal numbers are not great. I think the UCP would love it if they could tell her to just, door knock and Medicine Hat for the whole campaign and not talk to media. But it's kind of hard to do that when you're the party leader, right? There's going to be microphones in her face. And I think that creates some opportunity for the NDP. On the other side, as James was alluding to, you've got people who have never voted NDP their entire lives, federally or provincially in Calgary. who the NDP need to vote for them this election campaign, and that's a big step for people, right? So. I think there's challenges obviously on both sides, but there's definitely a path to victory, I think, for both parties, which makes it very interesting as a campaign for us to watch.
Andrew, do you see this as a toss-up race, or do you think the UCP still has the advantage as the incumbent?
I think there is an incumbent advantage still here. I think, though, to Dan's point, I think it is very competitive. I think you assessed it right, Dan. That leadership, Danielle Smith is a bit of a wild card. She kind of snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in a previous election, a number of years back, and so there's a bit of that in the backdrop. Can she close the deal if in this one? I think on the flip side, though, the NDP have a brand problem in Alberta. I mean, Alberta's not doesn't have that traditional base, and James kind of alluded to it of that kind of core support. And I think I think what you see is the UCP and they also have the NDP have a bit of a problem in the sense that they're not that far removed from when they lost power, and it wasn't. The memories of that government are not great. Now, I mean, the price of oil fell into the basement. The economy tanked. There was all kinds of problems. Not Rachel Notley's doing, but as premier, she owned it. The NDP owned it, and I think that is going to be. You already start to see a bit of that in some of the advertising where they're going to pin the economic abilities of the NDP. They're going to tie Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau because Justin Trudeau is very unpopular in that province, and they're going to tie some of the environmental stuff. And they're going to basically say, hey, let's not forget where we were when the NDP left power. The economy's coming back. I know, like, UCP government this past 4 years haven't been great, but hey, we had a pandemic. And I think to Dan's point, they got to figure out how they manage Danielle Smith. I mean, I'd start by taking her off open line radio every week. That would probably be a first step, but whatever. I'm not in that campaign.
James, how does the NDP handle those issues that Andrew just talked about?
Well, I would challenge Andrew's assessment that there's a bad taste in the mouth of voters from the previous NDP government. As an Ontarian, I can tell you that many New Democrat door knockers still get Bob Rae thrown at their face. So if we're comparing apples to apples, definitely Rachel Notley, and you mentioned the incumbency benefit and advantage, and to a certain degree, I think Rachel carries that as well. People knew what they got. She is steady. She is predictable. She is who she says she is. There's that genuine authenticity, and people know what they're going to get. And you alluded to this a little bit, Andrew, but that there may not be quite the steadiness from Danielle Smith. Every now and then you don't know what she's going to say. It seems to be that some things have gotten a bit more under control. The Sovereignty Act debate seems to be shelved. But then they go and do something like the oil and gas royalty issue, which is kind of blowing up in many rural municipalities. And we've now received one of those patented clarifications on my previous statement. If that becomes the hallmark of her leadership, and it does come down to leadership, and I said that these voters wake up being naturally PC voters, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they associate to the UCP, right? They're progressive conservative voters. That's where their mainstay was, and they're divided about which way to go. And I think New Democrats' challenge is to convince them at the end of every single day up until election day that no, you belong with us. We need you. Rachel, she's trusted. The issues, what she says she's going to do, all that stuff. And I think that this is going to be a fascinating one to watch. The starting lineup. I don't think anyone would put money on the outcome of this thing. And even if we look at the 2015 campaign, that the odds against what happened there, all this to say is that elections matter. Alberta is a very engaged populace. Your barber will engage with you on issues of the economy in Alberta. It is a very engaged populace. But when the election comes, I think it's game on, and we're going to really see how the chips fall. But Calgary is the target. They're spending lots of time there. The leaders, it is the place to be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll finish on this just because it's been such a big story this week. The news or the reports from the Globe and Mail about Chinese interference in the last federal election. So I'm just curious to hear from each of you. Maybe we can go James, Andrew, and Dan. What first of all, what role it would have played in the last election? But is this an issue? Is this going to be an issue going forward, both in terms of actual interference, but also politically? Is this a dangerous issue in terms of politics? James, you can kick us off.
I think, the seriousness of it should not be understated, right? Like it is the issue we hold dear. We teach in grade 5 civics courses. Voting is something internal, and the idea that it's being influenced even a little bit by externalities is problematic, and the response to that needs to be up there. I don't think we've seen quite that response. And I think that may be a bit problematic. Some people are calling for it, and I think it's going to be in the background, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. On the political side, I think I'm from Ottawa, and I've spent a lot of time there, and the issue that our intelligence agency is leaking information to the paper of record nationally is problematic for the government. It seems like a real issue they have to get their heads wrapped around, but not only that, it harkens to other problems they may be having internally about issues management and strategic direction. I don't know how this is going to play out. We've seen that Conservative candidate in British Columbia who's gotten a lot of attention because he pushed back really hard against interference from foreign entities. I don't know how much more legs it has, but it's such a hot topic that it's unpredictable on where it's going to go. Committees have it in control, and in a minority government, committees can do a lot of things. It's really problematic for incumbent governments when a minority committee brings in a former prime minister to sit and testify, right? Like they have a lot of power and a lot of control, and if the Conservatives want to drag this out and the New Democrats and Bloc think it's advantageous for them to drag it out, they're going to drag it out for as long as possible, and that can be really problematic for Liberals.
Andrew, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I agree with James that I think this is a serious problem. I mean, China's kind of the focus right now, but Russia's somewhere not far from the wings on this. And I just know from a general democracy perspective, I've done some work with elections in Ontario. I mean, people's faith in the democratic process is being shaken. I mean, Trump and his nonsense. Like, don't pretend that's just Americans. I mean, people translate that and internalize that and look at things in Canada. Then they hear this, so it's bad. And I think government, Elections Canada and agencies like that need to be very, very vigilant, very serious, and demonstrate that they're taking it seriously. Politically, I mean, and I'll speak from what I think from the Conservative Party perspective. I think they have to be a bit careful on this. I think they kind of, it's an easy target. James kind of identified a few things they can go after the government on. They can go after sort of maybe a lax. I think they have to be a bit strategic in the sense of the Conservative Party of Canada has a general kind of tone and demeanor challenge, right? Especially when it comes to new Canadians and that immigrant population. Lower Mainland is a key target market. GTA is key target market. It can't be seen as being over the top anti-one country, because it gets very difficult then within the country to start to distinguish, well, what does that mean about me? And I mean, I think, I go back to, the Jason Kenney, New Canadian Immigrant Roadshow that he took for the Harper Conservatives in 2009-10. I mean, this wouldn't be something that would be helpful to that. And I think they have to be a bit smart about it. It's serious though, so they can't. I think it's not right that they walk away from it, but it's just. I think it is a bit of a challenge for them. At least personally, I think it is. I'm not sure internally how they necessarily view it, but personally, I view it from a vote building coalition perspective. They need to be strategic in terms of how they look at this.
Dan, how about for you? Because for the Liberals, obviously, the implication is that they were the ones that benefited from this. So, do they have to seem a lot harder on it than the other parties? How does this kind of play in for the Liberals?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is, I guess, having done this podcast today, I realized that partisan pollster panels are a lot less heated than partisan pundit panels, because I found myself saying, "Oh, I agree with James and Andrew," and I agree with James and Andrew on this point as well too, and everything that they said here. In terms of the politics of it, yeah, I think it is one where the Liberals have to look like they're taking it seriously, because it is serious. Like, this is about the underpinnings of democracy, and as a result of that, you don't want to look like you're flippant about it or just dismissing it out of hand. And this is something that has a CSIS investigation, rightly so, and I think you want to show that you are as serious as the issue warrants for that reason. In terms of the impact that it had, I think, we don't obviously have high-level CSIS security clearance, so we can't say necessarily the level of it. I think this is one that's more, though, about the trust in democracy, as others said, and the underpinnings of democracy, as opposed to actually like the outcome. Because I mean, even a well-financed local campaign that's doing advertising and door knocking, GOTV, like, they're going to swing a couple percentage points in the riding. So I find it hard to to believe that the kind of things we're talking about here would actually make a huge difference in terms of raw vote numbers. But I think it is more of a principle and is more about just sort of people's faith in the system. And I think for that reason, it's important to for the parties to look like they're treating it seriously, and especially for the Liberals, given the dynamics around the issue.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I have a feeling this is a story that's going to be discussed for quite a while. As James said, could get into committee, that we're going to have some theater there, and who knows what else will come out of CSIS or the Globe Mail or anybody else who wants to report on information. So we'll probably get a chance to chat about it again. So thanks, James, Dan, and Andrew, for joining me, and I look forward to the next time we can get together.
Glad
Looking forward to it.
Take care, guys.
Thanks, Eric.